Sometimes life pushes you so low that even your own family starts to pity you. Jake Monroe knew that feeling well as he held his daughter's small hand, staring at the eviction notice on their apartment door. Everyone in town laughed when they heard about his inheritance. His godfather Tony left him a treehouse. Not money, not land, just an old treehouse that everyone said was worthless. Jake was broke, jobless, and out of options. His ex-wife called it fitting for a man who couldn't get his life together. His neighbors whispered behind his back. But Tony wasn't just some crazy old man living in the woods. He had built something incredible in that giant redwood tree. Something worth millions that powerful people had been searching for. What Jake thought was his biggest failure was actually the answer to everything. But when the whole world finds out what Tony really left him, will Jake be strong enough to protect it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of pine and wood smoke had always reminded Jake Monroe of his godfather Tony, even now, 3 weeks after the funeral. As he sat in the cramped kitchen of his one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by unpaid bills and his daughter's homework scattered across a table that wobbled on uneven legs, Jake found himself thinking about the last conversation he'd had with the old man. "You're a good father, Jake," Tony had said, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. "Better than you know. That little girl of yours sees the world differently because of you." At the time, Jake had laughed it off. Good fathers didn't get laid off from the lumberyard after 15 years. Good fathers didn't struggle to make rent every month. Good fathers certainly didn't end up with eviction notices taped to their doors while their 8-year-old daughters watched through the window. 8-year-old Rosie emerged from her bedroom now, her dark hair tangled from sleep, clutching the worn, stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since her mother left 2 years ago. She padded across the linoleum floor in her mismatched socks, the ones Jake had picked up from the discount store because the good ones were too expensive. "Morning, Dad," she said, climbing onto the chair beside him. Her voice carried that particular mixture of wisdom and innocence that sometimes made Jake forget she was still just a child. "You look sad." Jake smoothed down her hair, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Just thinking, sweetheart, about Godfather Tony." Rosie nodded solemnly. She had adored Tony during their infrequent visits to his property on the outskirts of town. While other children might have been frightened by the bearded old man who lived alone in the woods, Rosie had always gravitated toward his quiet presence and endless patience for her questions about birds, trees, and how things worked. The lawyer. "Man is coming today," she said, stating it as fact rather than question. Children had a way of absorbing information from adult conversations, even when you thought they weren't listening. "That's right. Mr. Henderson wants to talk about what Godfather Tony left us." Jake had met Clement Henderson exactly once before, at Tony's funeral. The lawyer was a thin man with kind eyes who had practiced in their small mountain town of Cedar Falls for longer than most people had lived there. He specialized in wills, property disputes, and the kinds of legal matters that arose when people lived their entire lives in one place, accumulating both property and grudges over generations. Cedar Falls wasn't the kind of place people moved to by accident. Nestled in a valley between forested ridges, it existed primarily because of the lumber mill that had provided steady work for 3 generations. Jake's grandfather had worked there, his father had worked there, and Jake had expected to work there until retirement. The mill's closure 6 months ago had scattered families like leaves in a storm, some moving to bigger towns, others clinging to the hope that someone would buy the operation and start it up again. Jake had chosen to stay, partly because moving required money he didn't have, partly because Cedar Falls was the only home Rosie had ever known. Now, with the eviction notice burning a hole in his consciousness, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Through the thin walls of the apartment complex, Jake could hear Mrs. Patterson's television, playing too loudly, and somewhere above them the Johnsons' baby was crying. These sounds had become the soundtrack of his reduced circumstances, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen from the modest house he'd shared with Sarah before their marriage fell apart. Mr. Henderson stood on the doorstep, briefcase in hand, wearing a suit that had probably been expensive 20 years ago. His smile was gentle but professional, the expression of a man who had delivered both good news and bad news, often enough to know that people's lives could change with a few words on paper. "Jake, good to see you again." "Hello there, Rosie." Rosie waved shyly from behind Jake's leg. She had inherited her father's caution around strangers, though she warmed up quickly once she decided someone was trustworthy. They settled around the wobbly kitchen table, Henderson placing his briefcase carefully on the least cluttered section. Jake poured coffee into 3 mismatched mugs, giving Rosie the one with the cartoon character that was mostly worn away from too many washings. "I won't take up much of your time," Henderson began, opening his briefcase with practiced efficiency. Anthony's will was quite straightforward, actually. Most of his possessions were donated to various environmental organizations. His property, all 40 acres, goes to the State Forestry Service with the stipulation that it remain undeveloped. Jake nodded. This much he had expected. Tony had always been passionate about preserving wild spaces, often talking about the importance of leaving something untouched for future generations. However, Henderson continued, pulling out a manila folder, there was one specific bequest to you and Rosie. He smiled at the little girl who had been listening with the intense concentration she brought to everything. Your godfather left you what he called the treehouse and all its contents. Jake felt his stomach drop. He had heard whispers around. In town since the funeral, people talking about Treehouse Tony and his crazy inheritance. He had hoped the rumors were exaggerated. "Just the treehouse?" Jake asked. "Not the land it's on?" "Just the structure itself and a 20-foot radius around the base of the tree. The rest of the property transfers to the state." Henderson reached into the folder and withdrew something that made Rosie gasp with delight. It was a wooden key, but unlike any key Jake had ever seen. Carved from what looked like a piece of redwood, it was intricate beyond belief. Tiny leaves and vines spiraled around the shaft, and the head was shaped like a miniature tree with branches extending in perfect symmetry. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each detail carved with the precision of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting the work. "Tony made this himself," Henderson said, placing it carefully on the table. "According to his instructions, this is the only key to the treehouse. He wanted you to have it, along with this letter." The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper that felt substantial beneath Jake's fingers. His name was written across the front in Tony's careful handwriting, the same script Jake remembered from birthday cards and the occasional note left on the windshield of his truck when Tony had borrowed. "Tools. Should I read it now?" Jake asked. Henderson shrugged. "That's up to you. Tony didn't specify." Jake looked at Rosie, who was examining the wooden key with wonder, turning it over in her small hands to study each carved detail. Her eyes met his, and he saw curiosity there, along with something that might have been hope. "Can we go see the treehouse, Dad?" she asked. "I remember it being really tall, but I was little then." Jake remembered their last visit to Tony's property, more than 2 years ago. Rosie had been 6 then, and they had taken a short hike through the woods to see the treehouse Tony had mentioned in passing. From what Jake recalled, it had been a simple wooden platform built around a massive redwood tree, accessible by a rope ladder. Rosie had been too small to climb up, and Tony had seemed almost relieved by that, as if he preferred to keep his private space truly private. Now, apparently, that private space belonged to them. "I suppose we should take a look at what we've inherited," Jake said, though the words felt strange in his mouth. Inherited, as if a treehouse was something substantial, something that mattered. Henderson closed his briefcase and stood. The property is about 15 miles north of town, off Forest Service Road 247. Tony's instructions were quite specific. He wanted you to discover everything for yourself. He said you'd understand when you saw it. After the lawyer left, Jake sat at the kitchen table, turning the wooden key over in his hands. The weight of it surprised him. It was heavier than it looked, as if the wood itself carried the density of years and intention. "Dad," Rosie said quietly, "do you think Godfather Tony was trying to help us?" The question hit him harder than he expected. Jake looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw Tony's influence in the way she considered things carefully before speaking, in the way she found wonder in small details. Tony had always treated her as if her thoughts and observations mattered, something that had seemed so natural Jake had never thought about it consciously. "I think maybe he was, sweetheart. Can we go today? To see the treehouse?" Jake glanced at the eviction notice, still folded on the counter where he'd left it after showing it to Henderson. They had 2 weeks before the sheriff would come to escort them from the apartment. 2 weeks to figure out what came next. Maybe Tony's treehouse wouldn't solve anything. Maybe it was just a curious old man's whimsical gift, a wooden platform in the woods that would provide a few hours of distraction before reality set in again. But as Jake looked at the intricate key, at the care that had gone into creating something so beautiful and personal, he felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in months. "Hope, yes," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Let's go see what Godfather Tony left us." The drive to Tony's property took them deeper into the forest than Jake remembered. Forest Service Road 247 wound through stands of Douglas fir and cedar, climbing steadily until the air grew thin and cool. Rosie pressed her face to the passenger window of Jake's aging pickup truck, watching for wildlife among the towering trees. "I forgot how quiet it is out here," she said, her breath fogging the glass. Jake had forgotten too. The silence felt almost sacred after months of apartment living, where every sound carried through thin walls and sleep came in fragments between his neighbors' arguments and the rumble of traffic on the main road through town. Here, the only sounds were the truck's engine and the whisper of wind through branches hundreds of feet above them. The turnoff to Tony's property was marked by nothing more than a gap in the trees and tire tracks worn into the forest floor. Jake followed the rough path for nearly a mile before it opened into a clearing where Tony's small cabin sat beside a vegetable garden that had gone wild with late summer growth. Jake parked beside the cabin and helped Rosie down from the truck. The wooden key felt warm in his pocket, as if it had absorbed heat from his body during the drive. Tony's instructions had been clear. The treehouse was accessible by following the marked trail that began behind the cabin. The trail was well maintained, wider than Jake had expected, with wooden markers every 100 yards or so bearing Tony's careful handwriting. Redwood Grove, 0.3 miles. Observation point, 0.5 miles. Home, 0.8 miles. Home. Jake found that curious. Tony had lived in the cabin, not in whatever treehouse he'd built in the woods. "Dad, look," Rosie called from ahead on the trail. She was pointing at something carved into the bark of a massive cedar tree. It was Tony's signature, along with the date and a small symbol that looked like a stylized tree within a circle. As they walked deeper into the forest, Jake began to notice more signs of Tony's presence. Solar panels had been discreetly mounted among the tree branches, their surfaces angled to catch the filtered sunlight that made it through the canopy. A small stream ran parallel to the trail, but instead of crossing it directly, the path followed. A wooden boardwalk that elevated walkers above the water without disturbing the natural flow. Godfather Tony really loved this place, Rosie observed, running her hand along the smooth railing of the boardwalk. The comment made Jake think about his godfather in a new way. Tony had never married, never had children of his own. This forest, This careful preservation and improvement of a wild space had been his way of nurturing something. Jake had always assumed Tony lived simply because he was eccentric or antisocial. Now he began to suspect there had been intention behind every choice. The trail curved around a massive boulder and suddenly opened into a grove of redwood trees that took Jake's breath away. He had seen redwoods before, but never this close. Never in a setting where he could truly appreciate their scale. The trees rose like cathedral columns, their trunks so vast that it would have taken a dozen people holding hands to encircle one. And there, in the center of the grove, was Tony's treehouse. Jake stopped walking and stared. This was not the simple wooden platform he remembered from his childhood visit. What he was looking at defied every assumption he'd made about his godfather's lifestyle and capabilities. The structure was built around and into the largest redwood tree, rising in multiple levels that seemed to grow organically from the trunk itself. Glass panels reflected the filtered sunlight, creating the impression that the treehouse was both solid and translucent. Cedar and steel formed graceful curves that followed the natural lines of the tree, as if the building had grown, rather than been constructed. "Oh my," Rosie whispered. Jake walked closer, his neck craning to follow the structure upward. The treehouse rose at least 60 feet into the air, with multiple levels connected by what appeared to be a spiraling walkway that wrapped around the trunk. At the base, a sophisticated entry system awaited them. No rope ladder, but a beautifully crafted door made from the same redwood as the key. The lock was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Instead of a traditional keyhole, there was an intricate wooden mechanism that seemed to await Tony's carved key. Jake pulled it from his pocket with hands that had begun to shake slightly. "Are you nervous, Dad?" Rosie asked. "A little," Jake admitted. He was beginning to understand that whatever Tony had built here was far beyond a simple treehouse. The solar panels he'd noticed along the trail were feeding power to something, and the sophisticated entry system suggested technology he hadn't expected. The wooden key slid into the mechanism with a satisfying click. Jake turned it, expecting to hear the simple tumbler of a standard lock. Instead, the mechanism responded with a series of soft chimes, like wind bells tuned to a perfect harmony. The door swung open silently, revealing an interior that made Jake's assumptions crumble entirely. The entry level was circular, following the curve of the tree trunk, with windows that provided panoramic views of the forest. But it was the technology that stopped Jake in his tracks. Embedded seamlessly into the wooden walls were touchscreens, showing what appeared to be environmental readings: temperature, humidity, wind speed, solar energy generation. A central console displayed a three-dimensional map of the surrounding forest, with various monitoring points marked in different colors. "Dad," Rosie said in a small voice, "I don't think this is just a tree house." Jake was beginning to reach the same conclusion. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, but more than that, the integration of technology and nature was unlike anything he'd seen. Whoever had designed and built this structure had possessed knowledge and resources far beyond what Jake had imagined Tony capable of. A spiral staircase led to the upper levels, crafted from the same redwood as the key and door. Each step was perfectly fitted, worn smooth but solid. As they climbed, Jake noticed that the tree's living wood had been preserved wherever possible. The structure seemed to embrace the tree rather than fight it, accommodating the natural growth, patterns and seasonal movements of the massive redwood. The second level contained what could only be described as a laboratory. Workbenches lined the curved walls, equipped with tools and equipment that Jake couldn't identify. Glass-fronted cabinets displayed an array of devices and components, all organized with scientific precision. At the center of the room, a large display screen showed rotating images of what appeared to be technical blueprints. "Look at this, Dad," Rosie called from beside one of the workbenches. She was examining a device the size of a shoebox, covered in solar panels and connected to what looked like water filtration equipment. A small placard beside it read, Portable water purification system. Prototype 7. Jake moved closer to examine the device. The engineering was elegant, with clean lines and an efficiency of design that spoke of countless hours of refinement. This wasn't the work of a hobbyist or eccentric hermit. This was advanced environmental technology, the kind of innovation that companies spent millions of dollars developing. The third level took their breath away entirely. It was clearly Tony's living space, but unlike any home Jake had ever seen. The room was circular, with floor-to-ceiling windows providing a 360-degree view of the forest canopy. Furniture was built into the structure itself, a bed that folded into the wall, a kitchen area with appliances that seemed to run entirely on solar power, a sitting area with chairs carved from single pieces of wood. But it was the fourth level that made Jake understand the true scope of what they had inherited. The top level was an observation deck, open to the sky but protected by a retractable glass dome. As they emerged onto the platform, Jake realized they were standing level with the crowns of the surrounding trees, looking out over a forest canopy that stretched to the mountains beyond. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the highest branches. "Dad," Rosie said, pointing to a bank of solar panels that crowned the structure, "how much do you think this all cost?" Jake had been wondering the same thing. The treehouse, no, the research facility, represented an investment that had to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more. The technology alone was worth more than Jake made in several years at the lumber yard. "I don't know, sweetheart. A lot." They stood together on the observation deck, father and daughter, trying to process what they had discovered. Jake felt as if he were seeing his godfather for the first time, understanding that Tony's simple lifestyle had been a choice rather than a limitation. The man who had seemed content with a small cabin and a vegetable garden had actually been living and working in a technological marvel that most people couldn't have imagined. A soft chime drew their attention to a panel Jake hadn't noticed before. A message was scrolling across a small screen. "Welcome, Jake and Rosie. Please explore freely. More will be revealed when you're ready." Jake stared at the message. Tony had somehow programmed the system to recognize them, to know they would come here together. The realization sent a chill down his spine. "Godfather Tony was really smart, wasn't he?" Rosie said. "Smarter than I ever knew," Jake replied. As they made their way back down through the levels of the treehouse, Jake's mind raced with questions. How had Tony built all this without anyone in town knowing? Where had he gotten the money for such sophisticated equipment? And most importantly, why had he left it all to them? The sun was beginning to set by the time they reached the entry level again. Jake locked the door carefully, the wooden key feeling heavier now that he understood what it opened. As they walked back down the trail toward the truck, Rosie slipped her hand into his. "Dad, are we rich now?" Jake considered the question. Rich was a relative term, but the tree house represented more wealth than he'd ever imagined having access to. The technology alone had to be worth a fortune, and the craftsmanship of the structure itself was beyond price. "I think we might be, sweetheart, but we need to understand what Godfather Tony wanted us to do with all this." As they drove back toward town, Jake's mind was spinning with possibilities and questions. The eviction notice was still taped to their apartment door, but it seemed less threatening now. Whatever Tony had built in that redwood tree, it was worth far more than Jake's rent problems, but something about the sophisticated technology and Tony's secrecy suggested there was more to the story. The message system had indicated that more would be revealed when they were ready. Ready for what? Jake had the feeling that discovering the treehouse was only the beginning of understanding what Tony had really left them. Jake couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the treehouse rising into the canopy, its glass panels reflecting filtered sunlight and its technology humming with quiet efficiency. The cramped apartment felt even smaller after spending the afternoon. In Tony's soaring creation, and the sounds of the city, traffic, neighbors, sirens, seemed harsh and intrusive. Beside him in the small bed they shared, Rosie slept peacefully, her dreams apparently untroubled by the magnitude of what they had discovered. Jake envied her ability to simply accept wonder without immediately calculating its implications. He had spent the evening making lists in his head, questions that needed answers, decisions that needed to be made, responsibilities he wasn't sure he was equipped to handle. By morning, Jake had made a decision. They would return to the treehouse, and this time they would explore more systematically. The message on the observation deck had promised that more would be revealed when they were ready. Jake wasn't sure what being ready meant, but he suspected it had something to do with understanding what Tony had actually been working on in that forest laboratory. "Can we go back today?" Rosie asked over breakfast, as if reading his thoughts. "That's exactly what I was thinking." This time, Jake brought supplies, water, sandwiches, a notebook, and his phone with its camera. If Tony had left them valuable technology, Jake needed to document it properly. The eviction notice remained taped to their door, but its urgency had dimmed. Whatever Tony had built was worth far more than 2 months' rent. The drive to the property felt familiar now, and Jake found himself anticipating the moment when the forest would open into Tony's grove. Rosie chattered about the treehouse during the drive, asking questions that Jake couldn't answer, but that showed she was thinking about what they had seen with the systematic curiosity she had inherited from her mother. "Do you think other people know about it?" she asked. "I don't think so. Tony was pretty private about his work, but how could he build something so big without anyone helping?" It was a good question. The treehouse wasn't something one person could have constructed alone, not with the sophisticated technology and precision craftsmanship they had observed. Someone had helped Tony, or he had hired crews and somehow convinced them to keep quiet about the project. When they reached the grove, Jake approached the treehouse with more confidence. The wooden key felt comfortable in his hand now, and the chiming lock mechanism seemed to welcome them back. Inside, the environmental displays showed slightly different readings than the day before, confirming that the systems were actively monitoring the forest conditions. "Let's start with the laboratory level," Jake said. "I want to understand what Tony was actually working on." The second-level laboratory was even more impressive in daylight. Jake began systematically examining the equipment and prototypes, using his phone to photograph everything while taking notes in his notebook. The water purification device Rosie had found was just one of dozens of innovations displayed throughout the space. On one workbench, Jake found prototypes for what appeared to be ultra-efficient solar cells, their surfaces covered with a material that seemed to absorb and concentrate even the filtered light that made it through the forest canopy. Another bench held components for wind generators designed to operate in the gentle air currents of the forest understory. But it was when Jake discovered Tony's filing system that the true scope of his godfather's work became clear. The files were organized in cedar cabinets that matched the treehouse's construction, each drawer labeled with precise handwriting. Jake pulled open a drawer labeled Water Systems and found himself looking at detailed blueprints for the purification devices, along with technical specifications, test results, and patent applications. Patent applications. Jake stared at the official documents, trying to process what he was seeing. Tony hadn't just been tinkering with environmental technology, he had been developing patentable innovations with commercial potential. "Dad, look at this!" Rosie called from across the laboratory. She was standing beside a large display screen that had activated when she approached. The screen showed a 3-dimensional rotating image of what appeared to be a house, but not like any house Jake had ever seen. The structure seemed to grow from the landscape, its walls curving organically, and its surfaces covered with vegetation. Text scrolled beside the image. Integrated living system, prototype housing for climate resilience. Jake joined Rosie at the display. Using touch controls that responded intuitively, he was able to rotate the image and zoom in on different sections of the design. What he saw was breathtaking, a completely self-sufficient dwelling that generated its own power, purified its own water, grew its own food, and integrated so completely with the natural environment that it seemed to disappear into the landscape. "This is what Godfather Tony was really working on," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. He wasn't just building a tree house, he was designing the future. Jake spent the next hour exploring the display system, discovering that it contained dozens of innovative designs. Solar collectors that looked like leaves, wind generators disguised as trees, water systems that mimicked natural stream flow, food production systems that worked with, rather than against, natural ecosystems. Each design was accompanied by detailed engineering specifications, cost projections, and environmental impact assessments. This wasn't the work of an eccentric hermit. It was the research and development program of a visionary environmental engineer. In another filing cabinet, Jake found Tony's personal notebooks. The handwriting was familiar, the same careful script he remembered from birthday cards, but the content revealed a mind engaged with complex technical challenges and ambitious goals. The future of human civilization depends on learning to live within natural systems rather than replacing them. One entry read, "We must design communities that enhance rather than degrade the environments that sustain us. The technology exists. What we lack is the wisdom to implement it on a scale that matters." Jake read entry after entry, each one revealing more of Tony's vision and dedication. His godfather hadn't been hiding in the woods, he'd been working to save the world. "Rosie, come look at this," Jake called. She joined him at the notebook, reading over his shoulder with the concentration she brought to all text. "Godfather Tony wanted to help the earth," she said simply. "I think he did more than want to help," Jake replied. "I think he figured out how." As they continued exploring the laboratory, Jake began to understand that they had inherited more than a treehouse or even advanced technology. They had inherited a mission. Tony had spent years, possibly decades, developing solutions to environmental challenges that were becoming more urgent every year. The treehouse itself was a proof of concept, demonstrating that sophisticated human living could exist in harmony with natural systems. The question was, what did Tony expect them to do with this inheritance? Jake found part of the answer in a folder labeled Implementation Strategy. The documents inside outlined plans for sharing Tony's innovations with the world, but not through traditional commercial channels. Instead, Tony had envisioned a foundation that would freely distribute the technology to communities that needed it most, places threatened by climate change, water scarcity, or energy poverty. The goal is not profit, but proliferation. 1. Document explained. These technologies must reach the people and places where they can do the most good, regardless of their ability to pay. Jake sat back in Tony's chair, trying to process the implications. His godfather had left them not just wealth, but responsibility. The treehouse and its technology represented years of work toward a goal that was larger than personal success or financial security. "Dad," Rosie said quietly, "do you think we're supposed to continue Godfather Tony's work?" Jake looked at his daughter, seeing Tony's influence in the thoughtful way she considered complex questions. "I think maybe we are, sweetheart, but I'm not sure we're qualified for something this important. Godfather Tony must have thought we were," she replied with the simple logic of childhood. "Otherwise, he wouldn't have left it to us." As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the laboratory, Jake made copies of the most important documents and files. He needed time to study and understand what Tony had really been working on, and he needed to research the commercial potential of the innovations they had inherited. But first, he needed to understand who else might know about Tony's work. In a file labeled correspondence, Jake found letters and emails that made his blood run cold. Companies were indeed interested in Tony's innovations, very interested. Environmental technology firms, energy corporations, and government agencies had all attempted to contact Tony over the years, some offering to buy his patents, others threatening legal action if he didn't share his research. The most recent letter was dated just 2 months before Tony's death. It was from a company called Meridian Energy Solutions, and the tone was distinctly threatening. "Mr. Kovac," it read, "our patience with your refusal to cooperate is wearing thin. The technologies you have developed represent significant commercial opportunities that could benefit millions of people. Your selfish hoarding of these innovations borders on criminal negligence. We strongly advise you to reconsider our generous offer before we are forced to pursue other options." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the forest air. If companies like Meridian Energy Solutions knew about Tony's work, they would soon know about the inheritance. And if they had been threatening Tony, they might not hesitate to pressure Jake as well. "Dad, you look worried," Rosie observed. "I think we might have inherited more than just a treehouse and some technology," Jake said carefully. "I think we might have inherited some problems too." As they locked up the treehouse and walked back toward the truck, Jake's mind was racing. With new concerns, Tony's work was valuable, potentially worth millions of dollars, but that value came with risks. Companies and organizations that wanted access to the technology might not respect Jake's right to control how it was used. The drive back to town was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Jake was beginning to understand that the treehouse represented not just an answer to their financial problems, but a choice about what kind of future they wanted to help create. By the time they reached their apartment, Jake had made another decision. Tomorrow, he would begin researching Meridian Energy Solutions and the other companies that had contacted Tony. If they were going to inherit Tony's mission, they needed to understand what they were up against. The eviction notice was still taped to their door, but now it seemed like the least of their worries. Jake spent the next morning at the Cedar Falls Public Library, using their internet connection to research the companies that had been contacting Tony. What he discovered made him understand why his godfather had been so secretive about his work. Meridian Energy Solutions was a subsidiary of a multinational corporation with a history of acquiring small technology companies and their patents, often through aggressive legal tactics. Environmental advocacy groups had accused them of purchasing promising green technologies, only to shelve them when they threatened the parent company's traditional energy interests. Other companies on Tony's correspondence list had similar profiles: large firms with the resources to tie up patents in legal battles for years, effectively preventing innovations from reaching the market if they chose to do so. "Daddy, you've been reading for a long time," Rosie said, looking up from the children's book she had been reading at the library table beside him. "I'm trying to understand some complicated grown-up stuff about Godfather Tony's work. Is someone trying to take it away from us?" Jake was continually amazed by his daughter's ability to cut through complexity and identify the essential issue. "Some people might try," he said, "but we're not going to let them." As they walked home from the library, Jake's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Monroe, this is Rebecca Chen from Meridian Energy Solutions. I understand you've recently inherited some property that might interest our company." Jake stopped walking. "How did you get this number?" "Public records, Mr. Monroe. When someone inherits property, it becomes a matter of public record. We'd very much like to discuss a business opportunity with you." "I'm not interested," Jake said, his voice sharper than he had intended. "I think you might reconsider when you hear our offer," Chen continued smoothly. "We're prepared to pay substantial money for certain technologies that may have been on the property you inherited. Technologies that could benefit millions of people if properly developed and distributed." Jake thought about the threatening letter he had found in Tony's files. And if I'm not interested in selling? Well, that would be unfortunate. For everyone involved, the line went dead. Jake stared at his phone, his hands trembling slightly with anger. They hadn't even been to the treehouse themselves, and already corporate interests were circling like vultures. "Who was that, Dad?" Rosie asked. "Someone who wants to buy Godfather Tony's inventions. Are we going to sell them?" Jake looked down at his daughter, seeing Tony's influence in her serious expression. "What do you think we should do?" Rosie considered the question with the gravity she brought to important decisions. "I think Godfather Tony left them to us because he trusted us to take care of them. If he wanted to sell them, he would have done it himself." Jake felt a surge of pride in his daughter's wisdom. "I think you're right." That afternoon they returned to the treehouse. This time, Jake went directly to Tony's personal journals, looking for more information about his godfather's intentions and the pressures he had faced from commercial interests. What he found was both illuminating and disturbing. Tony's early entries revealed a brilliant engineer who had worked for major corporations before becoming disillusioned with their priorities. "They want innovations that generate profit, not solutions that solve problems," one entry read. "When I developed a water purification system that could provide clean water for refugee camps at a cost of pennies per gallon, they calculated that the profit margins were too low to justify production. Millions of people could have clean water, but the shareholders wouldn't get rich enough fast enough." Later entries documented Tony's decision to work independently, developing technologies that could be freely shared rather than locked up by patents and corporate ownership. "If I can create solutions that communities can build and maintain themselves using local materials and simple techniques, then no corporation can control who has access to clean water, renewable energy, or sustainable housing." Jake began to understand that Tony's isolation hadn't been about avoiding people. It had been about avoiding corporate pressure to commercialize his work in ways that would limit its benefit to humanity. "Dad, look at this," Rosie called from across the laboratory. She was examining a thick folder labeled "Letters to Jake." Inside were dozens of letters addressed to him, organized by date, the earliest from more than 5 years ago. Jake opened the first letter with hands that had begun to shake. "Dear Jake," it began in Tony's familiar handwriting. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have inherited the work of my lifetime. I know this responsibility seems overwhelming, but I chose you carefully. You have something that most people lack, the integrity to choose what's right over what's profitable." Jake read through letter after letter, each one revealing more of Tony's plan and expectations. His godfather had been preparing Jake for this inheritance for years, watching how he handled challenges and setbacks, observing his dedication to Rosie despite the difficulties of single parenthood. "You've never taken the easy path when it would hurt someone else," one letter explained. "You've worked honest jobs for honest pay, even when dishonest shortcuts were available. You've put Rosie's well-being ahead of your own comfort. These qualities make you the right person to protect these innovations and ensure they reach the people who need them most." The final letter was dated just 1 month before Tony's death. "The pressure from corporations is increasing," it read. "They know I have developed technologies worth millions of dollars, and they are becoming more aggressive in their attempts to force me to sell. I fear that my time is running short, not because of age or illness, but because powerful interests will not allow these innovations to remain independent much longer." Jake felt a chill as he continued reading. "If something happens to me, you will face the same pressures. Companies will offer you enormous sums of money for technologies that could change the world. The temptation to accept will be strong, especially given your financial struggles. But I urge you to remember that the true value of these innovations lies not in their commercial potential, but in their ability to help communities become self-sufficient and resilient." The letter concluded with specific instructions. Take time to understand the technologies before making any decisions. Learn how they work, who could benefit from them, and what would happen if they were controlled by corporations instead of communities. Only then will you be able to make choices that honor the work and the people it was meant to serve. Godfather Tony was really worried about something, wasn't he? Rosie observed, reading over Jake's shoulder. He was worried about the same thing I'm worried about now, Jake replied. People who want to control his inventions instead of sharing them. As afternoon turned to evening, Jake explored more of Tony's documentation, finding detailed plans for sharing the technologies with communities around the world. Tony had identified specific regions affected by water scarcity, energy poverty, and climate change, where his innovations could make immediate differences in people's lives. But he had also documented the obstacles to implementation, patent laws that could be used to prevent communities from building the technologies themselves, corporate interests that preferred profitable complexity over simple solutions, and government regulations that could be manipulated to protect established industries. It's like a game, Jake said, speaking his thoughts aloud, but the stakes are whether people have clean water and renewable energy. It doesn't sound like a very fun game, Rosie replied. Jake's phone rang again. This time it was a different number, but when he answered, he recognized Rebecca Chen's voice. Mr. Monroe, I hope you've had time to consider our conversation. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for any environmental technologies that might be on your inherited property. I told you I'm not interested. That's unfortunate, because we have reason to believe you've inherited technologies developed by Anthony Kovac. Those technologies represent intellectual property that may rightfully belong to our company. Jake felt his anger flare. Those technologies belong to me. Tony left them to me legally. Legal ownership can be complex, Mr. Monroe. Patents can be challenged. Technologies can be claimed by prior inventors. We would prefer to handle this as a business transaction rather than a legal dispute. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of the realities of intellectual property law. We strongly encourage you to accept our offer before the situation becomes more complicated. This time, Jake hung up before Chen could continue. His hands were shaking with anger and something that might have been fear. "Dad, are you okay?" Rosie asked. Jake looked at his daughter, then at the laboratory around them filled with Tony's life work. "I'm okay, sweetheart, but I think we need to learn more about what Godfather Tony built and why it's so important." As they locked up the treehouse and walked back toward the truck, Jake made a decision. He would spend the next few days studying Tony's technologies and plans until he understood them well enough to make informed choices about their future. But first, he needed to find someone who could help them protect what they had inherited from people who wanted to control it. The eviction notice was waiting for them when they returned to the apartment, but Jake barely glanced at it. They had bigger challenges now and potentially greater opportunities. Tony had trusted them with his life's work. Jake was determined to prove worthy of that trust. Jake decided they needed to stay at the treehouse for several days to properly understand what Tony had built. The apartment held nothing for them now except the pressure of unpaid bills and corporate phone calls, while the treehouse offered both sanctuary and the answers they needed. "It's like camping, but with better technology," Rosie observed as they packed supplies for an extended stay. Jake had called the apartment complex manager and arranged to move out early, citing family circumstances. The security deposit would cover most of what they owed, and frankly, the treehouse was more comfortable than their cramped apartment had ever been. The living level of the treehouse revealed new wonders every day. The kitchen operated entirely on solar power stored in battery systems so advanced that Jake had never heard of the technology. Water came from a spring that Tony had tapped and filtered through a system that removed impurities while preserving beneficial minerals. The temperature regulation system worked by circulating air through underground chambers that maintained steady temperatures year-round. Godfather Tony thought of everything, Rosie said, exploring the compact but complete living space. On their second night in the treehouse, Jake made a discovery that changed his understanding of Tony's work entirely. Hidden behind a bookshelf, accessible only by manipulating a sequence of wooden panels in the correct order, was a room that hadn't appeared on any of the displays or maps they had found. The hidden room contained Tony's most advanced prototypes, including working models of technologies that seemed almost magical in their sophistication. A water purification system the size of a briefcase that could turn any contaminated water source into clean drinking water. Solar collectors thin as paper that could be rolled up and transported anywhere. Wind generators so efficient they could provide power from breezes too gentle to feel. But the centerpiece of the hidden room was a complete model of a sustainable community. A miniature version of what human settlements could look like if they were designed around Tony's innovations. The model showed houses that generated more energy than they consumed, water systems that purified and recycled every drop, food production systems that enhanced rather than depleted soil quality. "It's like a tiny, perfect town," Rosie said, studying the model with fascination. Jake read the documentation that accompanied the community model. Tony had calculated that a settlement designed around his technologies could house 500 people while having a positive environmental impact, actually improving air quality, water purity, and soil health compared to undeveloped land. This isn't just about individual inventions, Jake realized. Tony figured out how to redesign human civilization. The implications were staggering. If communities could be truly self-sufficient and environmentally positive, they could survive climate change, economic collapse, or resource scarcity. They could provide prosperity without environmental destruction. On their third morning in the treehouse, Jake's phone rang earlier than usual. This time it wasn't Rebecca Chen from Meridian Energy Solutions. It was a reporter from the Cedar Falls Gazette. "Mr. Monroe, I'm calling about the unusual inheritance you recently received. We've heard some interesting rumors about a structure on the property that might be of public interest." Jake's heart sank. "I don't have any comment. We understand there might be some sort of advanced technology involved. Our readers would be very interested in a local story about innovation and environmental sustainability. How did you hear about this?" "Sources close to the situation. We're planning to run a story with or without your cooperation, but we'd prefer to include your perspective." Jake hung up, his mind racing. If the local newspaper was interested, larger media outlets wouldn't be far behind. And if the story became public, corporate pressure would intensify dramatically. "Dad, what's wrong?" Rosie asked, seeing his expression. "People are starting to find out about the treehouse. That could make things complicated." Jake spent the morning researching intellectual property law and environmental technology patents. What he learned was deeply troubling. Large corporations had lawyers dedicated to finding ways to claim ownership of promising technologies, often through obscure patent disputes or claims of prior invention, even when inventors had clear legal rights to their work. Defending those rights against well-funded corporate legal teams could bankrupt individuals and small organizations. But Jake also discovered something encouraging. Tony had been methodical about protecting his work. Every innovation was thoroughly documented, with clear evidence of original development and testing. Many of the technologies were protected by patents that Tony had filed years before any corporate interest had emerged. More importantly, Tony had structured his intellectual property in a way that made it difficult for corporations to acquire through hostile means. Instead of traditional patents that could be bought and sold, Tony had used a combination of open-source licensing and community ownership models that ensured the technologies would remain freely available. Godfather Tony was really smart about protecting his inventions. Jake told Rosie as they ate lunch on the observation deck. What happens if bad people try to take them anyway? It was a question Jake had been pondering. Legal protections were only as strong as someone's ability to enforce them, and corporations like Meridian Energy Solutions had resources that Jake couldn't match. That afternoon, Jake's phone rang again. This time it was someone unexpected, Dr. Maria Santos from the University of California's Environmental Engineering Department. Mr. Monroe, I'm calling about the work of Anthony Kovacs. I understand you may have inherited some of his research and prototypes. Jake's guard went up immediately. I'm not interested in selling anything. Oh, I'm not calling to buy anything. Dr. Santos said quickly, I'm calling to offer help. Tony and I corresponded for years about sustainable technology development. He shared some of his innovations with our research group, and we've been working to implement them in developing communities around the world. Jake felt a surge of hope. You knew Tony? We never met in person, but we collaborated extensively through email and video calls. Tony was brilliant, but he was also deeply concerned about keeping his work away from corporate interests that would limit its beneficial impact. Dr. Santos explained that Tony had been working with a network of academic researchers, environmental organizations, and community development groups to test and refine his technologies in real-world applications. Several of his innovations were already being used successfully in off-grid communities in Central America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Tony told me he was training someone to continue his work, Dr. Santos continued. Someone he trusted to make decisions based on human need rather than profit potential. I assume that someone is you. Jake felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. I'm not an engineer or a scientist. I worked at a lumber yard. Tony didn't choose you for your technical expertise, Dr. Santos replied. He chose you for your character. The technical knowledge can be learned. Integrity and good judgment can't be taught. Dr. Santos offered to connect Jake with the network of organizations that had been working with Tony, and to provide legal and technical support to help protect his innovations from corporate appropriation. She also warned him that media attention would bring both opportunities and dangers. Environmental technology is a multi-billion-dollar industry, she explained. Companies that control traditional energy sources see innovations like Tony's as existential threats. They will use every legal and financial tool available to prevent these technologies from reaching communities that could benefit from them. After the call, Jake felt both encouraged and daunted. Tony had built more than individual innovations. He had created a movement towards sustainable community development. But that movement was under threat from powerful interests that preferred profitable complexity over simple solutions. Dad, Rosie said that evening, as they watched the sunset from the observation deck, do you think we can really help people with Godfather Tony's inventions? Jake looked at his daughter, silhouetted against the forest canopy, and felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in months. I think we have to try, sweetheart. Tony trusted us with something important, and there are people who need these technologies. Even if it's scary, especially if it's scary, the most important things usually are. That night, as Rosie slept in the comfortable bed that folded down from the treehouse wall, Jake stood on the observation deck, looking out over the forest. The solar batteries provided gentle lighting that didn't interfere with the stars, and the silence was broken only by the whisper of wind through branches and the distant call of an owl. For the first time since his layoff from the lumber yard, Jake felt a sense of purpose that went beyond paying bills and avoiding eviction. Tony had left them more than a home and financial security. He had left them a mission that could help communities around the world become more resilient and sustainable. But Jake also understood that accepting that mission would mean confronting corporate interests with resources and determination far beyond anything he had ever faced. The phone calls from Meridian Energy Solutions were just the beginning. If Tony's technologies were as valuable as they appeared, much larger forces would soon become involved. As he finally went to bed, Jake made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. They would stay at the treehouse, learn everything they could about Tony's work, and find ways to continue his mission of developing and sharing sustainable technologies. The eviction notice was still taped to their old apartment door, but it no longer mattered. They had found a new home and a new purpose. Now they just had to figure out how to protect both from people who wanted to control what Tony had created. Jake woke the next morning to find 3 news vans parked at the edge of Tony's property. Somehow, reporters had located the treehouse and camera crews were setting up equipment at the forest edge, apparently waiting for permission to approach. The structure. "Dad, there are people with cameras outside," Rosie said, peering through the treehouse windows with the caution of a child who understood that not all attention was welcome. Jake's phone had been buzzing with calls since dawn. Reporters, corporate representatives, and curiosity seekers who had heard rumors about an unusual inheritance in the forest. He had stopped answering after the 5th call from different news organizations, but one call he did take was from Dr. Santos, who had disturbing news. "Jake, I need to warn you about something. Our research network has been monitoring corporate patent filings, and Meridian Energy Solutions filed preliminary claims yesterday on technologies that sound suspiciously similar to Tony's innovations." Jake felt his stomach drop. How is that possible? They don't even have access to Tony's work. They don't need access to filed preliminary claims. They just need descriptions that are close enough to create legal uncertainty. Then they can use the legal process to force you into negotiations or costly court battles. Dr. Santos explained that this was a common corporate strategy, filing broad patent claims that might overlap with independent innovations, then using the threat of expensive litigation to pressure inventors into licensing agreements or outright sales. Tony anticipated this, she continued. He documented everything meticulously, specifically to defend against patent trolling. But you'll need legal representation to fight it, and that costs money you probably don't have. What do you suggest? Accept help. Tony was part of a network of organizations dedicated to keeping sustainable technologies freely available. We have lawyers, funding, and political connections, but you'll need to be public about Tony's work and your intentions for continuing it. Jake looked out at the news crews setting up their equipment. "I think that decision might have been made for us." After discussing strategy with Dr. Santos, Jake made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He would hold a press conference, show the world what Tony had built, and announce his intention to continue his godfather's work of developing and sharing sustainable technologies. "Are we really going to talk to all those reporters?" Rosie asked. "We're going to tell them about Godfather Tony's work and why it's important," Jake replied. "Sometimes the best way to protect something is to make sure everyone knows about it." Jake spent the morning preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his life. He reviewed Tony's documentation, practiced explaining the technologies in language that non-engineers could understand, and prepared answers for questions about his plans for the inheritance. At noon, Jake and Rosie walked down the trail toward the waiting reporters. Jake carried a folder of Tony's innovations and a determination to honor his godfather's vision, regardless of the corporate pressure that would surely follow. The press conference took place at the edge of the grove, with the massive redwood trees providing a dramatic backdrop. Jake had expected a handful of local reporters, but the crowd included national news crews, environmental journalists, and what appeared to be corporate representatives taking notes from the back of the group. "My name is Jake Monroe," he began, his voice steadier than he had expected. 3 weeks ago, my godfather Anthony Kovacs died and left me what everyone in town called a worthless treehouse. What he actually left me was 30 years of revolutionary environmental technology and a mission to share it with communities that need it most. Jake gestured toward the treehouse rising into the canopy behind him. Tony wasn't a crazy hermit living in the woods. He was a brilliant engineer who got tired of watching useful innovations get locked up by patent disputes and corporate profits. So he built this, a living laboratory where he could develop technologies that communities could build and maintain themselves. One reporter raised her hand. "What kind of technologies are we talking about?" Jake opened his folder and pulled out photographs of Tony's prototypes. Water purification systems that can turn any contaminated water source into clean drinking water for the cost of a few dollars. Solar collectors so efficient they can power homes from indirect sunlight. Wind generators that work in breezes too gentle to feel. Housing designs that generate more energy than they consume while integrating seamlessly with natural environments. The questions came rapidly after that. How much were the technologies worth? Who owned the patents? What were Jake's plans for? Commercialization. The technologies aren't for sale, Jake said firmly. Tony designed them to be freely shared with communities that need them. The patents are structured to prevent corporate appropriation while ensuring open access for non-profit implementation. "Mr. Monroe," called a reporter from the back of the group, "representatives from several major corporations have expressed interest in acquiring these technologies. Wouldn't commercial development help more people than limiting access to non-profit organizations?" Jake had anticipated this question, and his answer came from months of watching corporate interests override community needs in his own town. Tony spent years working for corporations that shelved promising technologies because they weren't profitable enough or because they threatened existing business models. He left these innovations to me specifically to prevent that from happening again. Clean water and renewable energy shouldn't be luxury items available only to people who can afford corporate prices. After the press conference, Jake allowed selected reporters to tour the treehouse, showing them Tony's laboratory and explaining how the integrated systems worked. The coverage that evening was overwhelmingly positive, with environmental groups praising Tony's innovations and Jake's commitment to continuing his work. But Jake also knew that positive media coverage would intensify corporate pressure to acquire the technologies. That evening, as news crews packed up their equipment and drove back toward town, Jake's phone rang with a call he had been expecting. "Mr. Monroe, this is Rebecca Chen from Meridian Energy Solutions. I trust you saw our preliminary patent filings today." "I saw them," Jake replied, "and I spoke with lawyers who explained what you're trying to do. We're trying to protect valuable intellectual property from being carelessly distributed without proper oversight," Chen said smoothly. "Your godfather's technologies could benefit millions of people if properly developed and marketed. Your plan to give them away will result in inferior implementations that could discredit the innovations entirely. What do you want? A licensing agreement that allows us to commercialize the technologies while providing you with substantial royalty payments. You keep ownership, we handle development and distribution. Everyone benefits." Jake thought about the communities Dr. Santos had described, places where Tony's technologies were already providing clean water and renewable energy without corporate oversight or profit margins. "And what happens to communities that can't afford your commercial prices?" "Market forces will eventually make the technologies affordable for everyone," Chen replied. "That's how innovation spreads. That's not how Tony wanted it to spread." "Mr. Monroe, I'm trying to offer you a reasonable solution to a situation that could become very expensive for you. Patent disputes can take years to resolve and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Are you threatening me again? I'm informing you of the realities of intellectual property law. We filed our preliminary patents in good faith, based on our own research and development. If there are conflicts with your godfather's patents, the courts will have to resolve them." After Chen hung up, Jake stood on the observation deck looking out over the forest. The solar batteries hummed quietly, storing energy from the day's sunlight. The water purification system cycled gently, ensuring a constant supply of clean water. The integrated systems that Tony had built worked in harmony with the natural environment, proving that human technology could enhance rather than degrade the world around it. "Dad," Rosie said, joining him on the deck, "are you worried about the patent people?" "A little," Jake admitted, "but I'm more worried about letting Godfather Tony down." "I don't think he'd be disappointed in us," Rosie said with the certainty that children brought to important truths. "We're trying to do what he wanted." Jake looked at his daughter, realizing that she understood Tony's mission as clearly as he did, perhaps more clearly. "You're right, sweetheart. We are doing what he wanted." That night, Jake made a series of phone calls to the network of organizations that Dr. Santos had described. Environmental lawyers offered to defend Tony's patents pro bono. Community development. Groups shared stories of places where similar technologies had transformed lives. Academic researchers proposed collaborations to refine and test new innovations. By morning, Jake understood that they weren't alone in this fight. Tony had built more than individual technologies. He had created a movement towards sustainable community development. That movement had allies with resources, expertise, and determination to match anything that corporate interests could bring to bear. The question was whether Jake and Rosie were ready to become the public faces of something larger than themselves, something that could change how human communities related to the natural world. 2 days after the press conference, Jake discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about Tony's inheritance. While exploring the treehouse's lower levels more systematically, Rosie found a hidden panel in the laboratory floor that Jake had missed entirely. "Dad, this piece of wood feels different," she said, running her fingers along what appeared to be a seamless section of the floor. When Jake examined the area Rosie had indicated, he found a wooden mechanism similar to the lock on the main door. Intricate, carved with the same precision as Tony's key, and clearly designed to be opened. By someone who understood the pattern, Jake spent an hour manipulating the wooden panels before he heard the familiar chime that indicated success. A section of the laboratory floor rose smoothly, revealing stairs that descended into the earth beneath the massive redwood tree. "There's more?" Rosie asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "Apparently there's a lot more." The stairs led down 20 feet into what could only be described as an underground research facility. Solar lighting activated automatically as they descended, revealing a space that was larger and more sophisticated than anything they had seen above ground. The underground laboratory contained equipment that Jake couldn't identify, prototypes that seemed decades ahead of current technology, and documentation that made him realize Tony's work was far more advanced than he had imagined. But it was the central display screen that stopped Jake in his tracks. As they approached, it activated automatically, showing a three-dimensional map of the world with hundreds of points marked in different colors. "Welcome to the Global Sustainability Network," a recorded voice said. Tony's voice, but speaking with an authority and confidence that Jake had never heard from his godfather. "If you're seeing this, then you've inherited not just my laboratory, but my role in coordinating the world's most advanced environmental technology development program." Jake stared at the display as Tony's recorded message continued. "For the past 15 years, I haven't been working alone. The research facility you've discovered is one of 12 similar installations around the world, each developed by engineers and scientists who shared my vision of freely available sustainable technology." The map zoomed in on various marked locations: a mountain laboratory in Switzerland, a desert research station in Morocco, an island facility in the Philippines. Each location was connected to the others by communication links that allowed researchers to share innovations and coordinate development. The treehouse you inherited is the North American Coordination Center for a global network, dedicated to developing and distributing environmental technologies that corporations can't control, Tony's voice explained. The researchers at these Facilities have been working together to create solutions for climate change, water scarcity, energy poverty, and sustainable food production. Jake felt dizzy as the implications became clear. Tony hadn't been a lonely hermit developing technologies in isolation. He had been coordinating a worldwide network of environmental innovators, and now Jake had inherited responsibility for continuing that coordination. Each facility specializes in different aspects of sustainable technology. The recording continued. Our location focuses on integrated community systems, how individual innovations can work together to create completely self-sufficient settlements. Other facilities specialize in water purification, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and climate adaptation. The display showed communications logs, indicating that the global network was active and ongoing. Researchers at other facilities had been waiting for someone to take over Tony's coordination role. The corporate pressure you're experiencing is nothing new, Tony's voice continued, as if anticipating Jake's concerns. Every facility in the network has faced attempts at acquisition, legal challenges, and political pressure. But our distributed structure and open-source approach makes us difficult to shut down or control. Jake explored the underground facility while the recording continued, finding prototypes that represented collaborations between researchers around the world. A water purification system developed in Morocco had been adapted for North American conditions. Solar collection technology from the Philippines had been integrated with battery systems developed in Switzerland. But the most remarkable discovery was a working model of what Tony called a sustainability seed, a complete package of technologies and knowledge that could transform any community into a self-sufficient, environmentally positive settlement within 5 years. The goal isn't just to develop individual technologies, Tony's recording explained. It's to create a reproducible model for human communities that enhance, rather than degrade, the environments that sustain them. Every innovation we develop is designed to work with every other innovation, creating integrated systems that become more efficient and resilient as they grow. Jake found documentation showing that sustainability seeds had already been successfully implemented in dozens of communities around the world. Refugee settlements that had become thriving eco-villages, rural communities that had achieved energy independence, urban neighborhoods that produced more food than they consumed. The work is more urgent now than ever, Tony's voice continued. Climate change is accelerating, and traditional approaches to environmental protection aren't enough. We need to demonstrate that human communities can be part of the solution, not just part of the problem. As the recorded message concluded, Jake was presented with a choice that he hadn't expected. The global network wanted to make him an official coordinator, giving him access to research from all 12 facilities and responsibility for North American implementation of their technologies. "Dad," Rosie said quietly, "Godfather Tony was like a secret superhero, wasn't he?" Jake laughed despite his overwhelming feelings. "I think he was, sweetheart, and I think he wants us to be secret superheroes too." But Jake also understood that accepting coordination responsibilities would make them much larger targets for corporate and political pressure. Individual facilities could maintain low profiles, but coordinators became focal points for anyone who wanted to stop or control the network's work. As if reading his thoughts, the display screen activated again, showing a new message. "Jake," Tony's voice said, "I know this seems overwhelming, but the network has resources and support systems that will help you succeed. You won't be working alone, and you won't be defenseless against corporate pressure." The screen showed legal protections, financial resources, and political connections that the global network had developed over 15 years. Environmental lawyers in dozen countries, academic researchers at major universities, government officials who understood the importance of freely available, sustainable technology. The choice is yours. Tony's voice concluded. You can continue working with just the technologies I developed here, helping communities one at a time. Or you can help coordinate a global effort to transform how human civilization relates to the natural world. Jake spent the next hour exploring the underground facility, finding technologies and collaborations that represented solutions to environmental challenges he hadn't even known existed. The scope of work was staggering, but so was its potential impact. What do you think, Rosie? Jake asked as they sat in the underground laboratory, surrounded by innovations that could change the world. Should we help Godfather Tony's friends with their secret superhero work? Rosie considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. Will it help more people? A lot more people. Will it be more dangerous? Jake thought about the corporate pressures they were already facing, the legal challenges that were already being filed, the media attention that was already intensifying. Probably not more dangerous than what we're already doing, but definitely more complicated. I think Godfather Tony wouldn't have shown us all this if he didn't think we could handle it, Rosie said finally. And I think people need help. Jake looked at his daughter and felt a surge of pride in her wisdom and courage. I think you're right on both counts. That evening, Jake activated the communication system that connected Tony's facility to the global network. For the first time, he spoke directly with researchers around the world who had been waiting months for someone to take over North American coordination. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, from the facility in Morocco, spoke about water purification, systems that could serve refugee camps. Dr. James Chen from the Philippines described renewable energy systems that could power island communities. Dr. Sarah Okafor from Switzerland explained climate adaptation technologies that could help agricultural communities survive changing weather patterns. Each researcher shared stories of communities that had been transformed by freely available sustainable technologies. But they also warned about intensifying corporate and political pressure to control or shut down their work. The network is only as strong as our coordination, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Individual facilities can be isolated and pressured, but working together, sharing innovations and supporting each other, we're much more difficult to stop. By the end of the call, Jake had accepted responsibility for coordinating North American implementation of the network's technologies. It was a decision that would change their lives completely, but it felt like the natural extension of everything Tony had taught them about protecting and sharing innovations that could help people. As Jake and Rosie climbed back up the stairs to the treehouse proper, Jake realized that inheriting Tony's work had been just the beginning. Now they were part of something larger, more important and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But they were also part of a global community, dedicated to proving that human technology could heal rather than harm the world. And that felt like the most important work they could possibly do. Jake's decision to join the global network triggered events that escalated faster than he had anticipated. Within days of his first coordination call, corporate pressure intensified. Dramatically, legal challenges multiplied, and media attention reached levels that made their previous coverage seem insignificant. Mr. Monroe, Rebecca Chen from Meridian Energy Solutions said during her daily phone call, "We've learned that you're now claiming to coordinate an international network of environmental technology facilities. This changes the scope of our intellectual property concerns significantly." Jake had stopped trying to avoid Chen's calls. Better to understand what corporate interests were planning than to be surprised by their actions. Our preliminary research suggests that technologies developed at various international facilities may infringe on patents held by our parent company and affiliated organizations, Chen continued. We're prepared to file comprehensive legal challenges unless this situation is resolved through negotiation. What kind of negotiation? Jake asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Exclusive licensing agreements for all technologies, developed by your network, with appropriate compensation for patent holders and oversight to ensure proper commercial development. After Chen hung up, Jake called Dr. Santos to discuss the escalating corporate pressure. What she told him was both encouraging and alarming. Environmental lawyers around the world have been expecting this, Dr. Santos explained. Corporate interests have been monitoring sustainable technology development for years, waiting for an opportunity to assert control over promising innovations. Your decision to coordinate the network openly has given them that opportunity. But Dr. Santos also had good news. We've been preparing for this fight. Environmental organizations, academic institutions, and government agencies in 12 countries are ready to support the network's independence. The legal battle will be complex, but we have resources and determination to match anything the corporations can bring. Jake felt both relieved and overwhelmed by the scope of support the network had assembled. But he also understood that the fight would be fought on multiple fronts. With his family at the center of international attention they had never sought. There's something else you need to know, Dr. Santos continued. We've received information suggesting that corporate interests are planning more than legal challenges. They're organizing a coordinated campaign to discredit the network's work and question your qualifications to continue Tony's research. What kind of campaign? Media stories questioning whether sustainable technologies developed by independent researchers are safe or effective. Political pressure to investigate the network for tax violations or regulatory compliance. Personal attacks on network coordinators, suggesting they're unqualified or motivated by anti-corporate ideology rather than genuine environmental concern. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the forest air. Are they targeting Rosie? Not directly, but they are researching your background, your finances, your personal relationships. They want to find anything that could undermine your credibility or suggest you're not capable of handling Tony's inheritance responsibly. That evening, Jake found Tony's final message in the underground laboratory. A recording that had been programmed to activate only after he had spoken with the global network and accepted coordination responsibilities. Jake, Tony's voice said, emanating from the central display screen, if you're seeing this message, then you've accepted the most important responsibility of my life. You're now protecting and coordinating work that could determine whether human civilization survives the environmental challenges ahead. The screen showed images of communities around the world that had been transformed by network technologies, refugee settlements that had become sustainable villages, agricultural regions that had adapted to climate change, urban neighborhoods that had achieved energy independence. The corporate pressure you're experiencing will intensify, Tony's voice warned. They understand that our network represents an existential threat to business models based on scarcity and environmental destruction. If communities can become truly self-sufficient, if clean water and renewable energy become freely available, if sustainable agriculture can feed people while healing damaged ecosystems, then many current industries become obsolete, Jake watched, as the screen displayed financial projections showing how network technologies could eliminate markets worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Energy utilities, water treatment companies, agricultural chemical producers, waste management corporations. This isn't just about patent disputes or licensing agreements, Tony's voice continued. This is about whether technological innovation will be used to create abundance and resilience for everyone, or controlled to maintain artificial scarcity that protects existing profit models. The recording revealed that Tony had been preparing for this confrontation for years. Hidden throughout the underground facility, Jake found evidence of comprehensive planning, legal strategies, media responses, political connections, and financial resources that could sustain the network through extended challenges. You have more support than you realize, Tony's voice explained. Governments around the world understand that sustainable technology development is a matter of national security. Academic institutions recognize that freely available innovations advance human knowledge faster than proprietary research. Environmental organizations know that community-based solutions are more effective than top-down corporate programs. But Tony's final message also contained a warning that made Jake's blood run cold. The most dangerous moment will come when corporate interests realize they can't control the network through legal or financial pressure. When that happens, they may resort to more direct methods of disruption. Be prepared for attempts to discredit the network's work through sabotage, to undermine coordinators through personal attacks, or to eliminate facilities through regulatory harassment. The screen showed security measures that Tony had built into each network facility, surveillance systems, communication redundancies, and protocols for protecting research and personnel if the facilities came under direct attack. Remember, Tony's voice concluded, you're not just protecting individual technologies, you're protecting humanity's ability to develop and share innovations that could prevent environmental collapse. The work you're doing is literally about whether human civilization has a sustainable future. Over the next several days, Jake felt the weight of Tony's warning as corporate pressure escalated on multiple fronts simultaneously. Legal challenges were filed in courts across North America, claiming that network technologies infringed on dozens of patents held by various corporations. Environmental lawyers worked around the clock to respond, but defending against multiple lawsuits required resources and attention that slowed actual technology development. Media stories began appearing that questioned the safety and effectiveness of technologies developed outside traditional corporate research programs. Industry-funded studies suggested that community-implemented sustainable technologies could fail catastrophically, potentially contaminating water supplies or creating electrical hazards. Government agencies received complaints about the network's tax status, regulatory compliance, and international coordination activities. Bureaucrats who had never shown interest in environmental technology suddenly demanded detailed documentation of every aspect of the network's operations. But the most troubling development was personal surveillance that Jake detected around the treehouse property. Vehicles parked at unusual locations on Forest Service roads, drones flying overhead with frequencies that suggested commercial rather than recreational use, phone calls and internet communications that seemed to be monitored or delayed. "Dad," Rosie said one evening as they watched the sunset from the observation deck, "are bad people watching us?" Jake had hoped his daughter hadn't noticed the surveillance, but children were often more observant than adults gave them credit for. "Some people are very interested in what we're doing," Jake said carefully, "but we have lots of friends helping to protect us." Like the other scientists Godfather Tony worked with? Exactly like that, Dr. Santos called that evening, with updates that were both encouraging and concerning. Environmental organizations around the world are mobilizing to support the network, she reported. "We're seeing unprecedented coordination between groups that have never worked together before. The corporate attack on your network has unified environmental advocates like nothing in recent history." But Dr. Santos also had warnings. "Our intelligence sources suggest that corporate interests are planning something more aggressive than legal challenges. We don't know exactly what, but security experts recommend increasing protection around all network facilities." Jake spent that night installing additional security measures that Tony had designed but never activated. Motion sensors throughout the forest around the treehouse, communication systems that could function even if normal phone and internet services were disrupted, emergency protocols for protecting essential research if the facility had to be evacuated. As dawn broke over the forest canopy, Jake stood on the observation deck, reviewing everything that had happened since that first visit to Tony's treehouse. In just a few weeks, they had gone from facing eviction to coordinating an international network of environmental innovations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But they had also become the focal point for corporate interests that viewed freely available sustainable technology as an existential threat to business models worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Are you ready for this? Jake asked himself, looking out over the forest that had become both their sanctuary and their battleground. The question felt both terrifying and unnecessary. Ready or not, the fight for the future of environmental technology was about to reach its climax, and Jake and Rosie were at the center of everything that would determine the outcome. The corporate escalation came exactly as Tony had predicted. Suddenly, comprehensively, and with resources that Jake had underestimated, Jake woke to the sound of helicopters circling the treehouse property. Through the observation deck windows, he could see vehicles assembled at multiple access points to the forest, including roads he hadn't known existed. By 7 a.m., the entire area was surrounded by corporate security, government officials, and media. Crews. Rebecca Chen's voice crackled through a bullhorn. Mr. Monroe, this is a lawful action to secure potentially dangerous environmental technologies pending resolution of patent disputes and regulatory compliance issues. Jake's phone buzzed with an emergency call from Dr. Santos. Jake, they're moving against all network facilities simultaneously. We have reports from Switzerland, Morocco, the Philippines. Corporate interests and government agencies are attempting to seize control of the research installations. On what grounds? Patent violations, environmental safety concerns, international technology transfer violations. They've apparently been planning this coordination for months. Jake looked down from the treehouse at the assembled forces below. He counted at least 20 vehicles, including what appeared to be specialized equipment for accessing elevated structures. These people had come prepared to take the treehouse, by force if necessary. "Dad, what's happening?" Rosie asked, awakening to the sound of helicopters and bullhorns. "Some people are trying to take Godfather Tony's inventions," Jake said, his voice calmer than he felt. "But we're not going to let them." Jake activated the treehouse's master control system, the sophisticated network of technologies that Tony had integrated throughout the structure. Immediately, the treehouse transformed from a passive research facility into an active demonstration of everything Tony had developed. Solar panels adjusted automatically to maximize energy collection from the morning sun. Water purification. Systems activated to demonstrate their capacity and efficiency. Air circulation systems created comfortable microclimates throughout the structure. Most importantly, communication systems connected the treehouse to the global network, broadcasting real-time documentation of the corporate assault to environmental organizations around the world. "Mr. Monroe," Rebecca Chen called through her. "Bullhorn. We have court orders authorizing seizure of technologies that violate patents held by our clients. Please exit the structure immediately so that our technical teams can secure the equipment safely." Jake activated the treehouse's external communication system, his voice carrying clearly to the assembled crowds below. "My name is Jake Monroe, and I'm speaking from a research facility developed by my godfather, Anthony Kovac. The technologies here aren't stolen or dangerous. They're innovations designed to provide clean water, renewable energy, and sustainable housing to communities that need them most." As Jake spoke, the treehouse's systems created a spectacular demonstration. Solar panels tracked the sun with precise efficiency, generating more power than the facility consumed. Water purification systems processed stream water into crystal clear, drinking water before their eyes. The structure itself seemed to breathe with the forest, its integrated design proving that human technology could enhance rather than destroy natural environments. "These innovations belong to humanity, not to corporations," Jake continued. "They were developed to be freely shared, not locked up by patents and profit margins." Below, Jake could see corporate representatives conferring urgently with government officials. The real-time demonstration was being broadcast to environmental organizations worldwide, creating exactly the kind of public awareness that corporate interests had hoped to avoid. Dr. Santos called again with updates from other network facilities. "Jake, something remarkable is happening." The simultaneous attacks on all facilities have triggered unprecedented public support. Environmental groups are mobilizing. Academic institutions are providing legal assistance, and government officials are questioning the corporate claims. From the observation deck, Jake could see that media crews were now interviewing environmental protesters who had arrived to support the treehouse. The corporate action that was supposed to quietly seize control of dangerous technologies had become a very public confrontation about the future of environmental innovation. Rebecca Chen's voice returned to the bullhorn, but her tone had shifted from confident authority to frustrated urgency. "Mr. Monroe, you're interfering with a lawful seizure of potentially hazardous materials. If you don't cooperate immediately, we'll be forced to take more aggressive action." Jake looked at Rosie, who was watching the confrontation below with the keen attention she brought to everything important. "What do you think, sweetheart? Should we keep showing people Godfather Tony's inventions?" "I think people should see what he made," Rosie replied with certainty. "It's really beautiful." Jake activated more of the treehouse's demonstration systems. The integrated food production areas showed how communities could grow their own food using sustainable methods. Climate control systems maintained perfect temperatures throughout the structure using minimal energy. Waste processing systems turned organic materials into useful compounds with zero environmental impact. Each system worked seamlessly with every other system, creating an integrated demonstration of how human communities could live in harmony with natural environments while enjoying sophisticated technological conveniences. The demonstration was having its intended effect. Jake could see government officials taking photographs and making notes. Environmental protesters were sharing real-time videos on social media. Even some of the corporate representatives seemed impressed by the sophistication and elegance of Tony's innovations. But Jake also understood that the corporate response would escalate. They had invested too much in this coordinated action to be deterred by public relations concerns. The standoff continued for 3 hours before Jake received the call that changed everything. "Jake, this is Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Morocco. We have extraordinary news. The corporate actions against our facilities have backfired completely. Instead of seizing control of our technologies, they've created a global movement for freely available environmental innovations." Jake looked down at the assembled crowds, which had grown substantially as word spread through social media and environmental networks. What kind of movement? Environmental organizations in 50 countries have announced coordinated support for the network. Academic institutions are offering legal and technical assistance. Government officials are questioning the patent claims and demanding public hearings about corporate attempts to control sustainable technologies. As Dr. Rodriguez spoke, Jake could see the atmosphere below changing. Government officials were now interviewing environmental protesters rather than supporting corporate representatives. Media crews were focusing on the treehouse's technological demonstrations rather than the seizure attempts. More importantly, Dr. Rodriguez continued, communities around the world are announcing plans to implement network technologies regardless of corporate patent claims. If corporations want to stop freely available clean water and renewable energy, they'll have to sue thousands of communities simultaneously. Jake felt a surge of hope that he hadn't expected. The corporate pressure is actually helping spread the technologies? Exactly. By trying to control our innovations through legal intimidation, they've created exactly the kind of public awareness we needed to make the technologies truly unstoppable. Rebecca Chen's voice returned to the bullhorn, but now she sounded desperate rather than authoritative. "Mr. Monroe, we're prepared to withdraw our patent claims and discuss alternative arrangements for technology distribution." Jake activated the external communication system again. "Ms. Chen, the technologies you're trying to control are already being freely distributed to communities that need them. Patent claims can't stop people from having clean water and renewable energy. Below, Jake could see corporate representatives in heated discussions with government officials. The legal basis for their seizure attempt was crumbling as environmental lawyers arrived to challenge every aspect of the corporate claims. Dr. Santos called with the most encouraging news yet. Jake, congressional representatives are demanding hearings about corporate attempts to control environmental technologies. They want to investigate whether patent laws are being misused to prevent communities from accessing sustainable innovations. But the most significant call came from an unexpected source, a representative of the United Nations Environmental Program. Mr. Monroe, this is Dr. Amara Okafor from UNEP. We've been monitoring the situation with your network facilities, and we'd like to propose a solution that could protect your technologies from corporate appropriation permanently. Dr. Okafor explained that the UN had been developing mechanisms for protecting environmental innovations that served global public interests. We can designate your network technologies as international environmental heritage, similar to how we protect cultural and natural heritage sites. This would make them legally exempt from patent disputes and corporate control. The proposal was extraordinary. International protection that would make the network's technologies permanently available to communities worldwide, regardless of corporate interests or patent claims. What would this mean for the network? Jake asked. Your technologies would be officially recognized as serving global environmental security interests. Communities could implement them freely. Academic institutions could study and improve them openly, and corporations couldn't use legal challenges to prevent their distribution. As Jake considered the UN proposal, he realized that Tony's plan was working exactly as intended. The corporate assault on the network had created the public awareness and political support necessary to protect environmental innovations permanently. Jake activated the treehouse's communication system one final time, addressing not just the crowds below, but the global audience that was now following the confrontation through social media and environmental networks. My godfather, Tony, spent 30 years developing technologies that could help communities become sustainable and resilient, Jake said. He didn't create these innovations for personal profit or corporate control. He created them because he believed that clean water, renewable energy, and sustainable housing should be available to everyone who needs them. Jake gestured toward the treehouse systems that continued their elegant demonstration around him. Today, people tried to seize control of these technologies through legal intimidation and corporate pressure. Instead, they've helped create a global movement for freely available environmental innovations. Below, Jake could see that the corporate representatives were packing up their equipment and preparing to leave. The seizure attempt had failed completely, and continuing the confrontation would only generate more negative publicity for their clients. The future of environmental technology won't be determined by patent disputes or corporate profits. Jake continued. It will be determined by communities that implement these innovations to meet their own needs, by researchers who continue developing them openly, and by governments that protect them as global public goods. As afternoon turned to evening, the crowds began to disperse, but not before environmental organizations had documented every aspect of the treehouse's systems and announced plans to implement similar technologies in communities around the world. Dr. Santos called with a final update. Jake, it's over. Corporate interests are withdrawing their patent challenges and seizure attempts. The public response has been so overwhelmingly negative that continuing would damage their clients more than the network technologies ever could. Jake stood on the observation deck as the forest returned to its natural quiet. The helicopters had departed, the vehicles had driven away, and only the whisper of wind through branches remained. Did we win? Rosie asked, joining him on the deck. Jake looked at his daughter and realized that winning had never been about defeating corporate interests. Winning had been about proving that environmental technologies could serve human needs rather than corporate profits. "I think Godfather Tony won," Jake replied. "And I think people all over the world are going to have clean water and renewable energy because of what he built." That evening, Jake signed the documents that designated the network's technologies as international environmental heritage. It was a decision that felt both momentous and inevitable, the natural conclusion of everything Tony had worked toward and everything Jake had learned about protecting innovations that could help heal the world. 6 months later, Jake stood in the same spot where he had once held an eviction notice, but now he was watching Rosie plant saplings in the forest around Tony's treehouse. The young trees were a gift from communities around the world that had implemented network technologies, each sapling representing a place where clean water, renewable energy, or sustainable housing had transformed lives. "The one from Morocco purifies water for 300 families," Rosie said, carefully placing soil around a cedar sapling. "The one from the Philippines powers a whole island with wind and solar." Jake smiled at his daughter's careful attention to the stories behind each tree. She had become the unofficial chronicler of the network's impact, collecting reports from communities that had benefited from Tony's innovations and maintaining correspondence with researchers at facilities around the world. The treehouse itself had become something Tony had never intended but would have loved. A pilgrimage site for environmental advocates, researchers, and community leaders who wanted to understand how sustainable technologies could be implemented at scale. Jake gave tours several times a week, explaining how individual innovations work together to create completely self-sufficient communities. But more importantly, the treehouse had become the coordination center for what environmental organizations were calling the most successful technology transfer program in history. Instead of corporate-controlled development that prioritized profit over access, the network's open-source approach had enabled rapid implementation in communities that needed sustainable technologies most urgently. Dr. Santos called that afternoon, with updates that had become routine but remained extraordinary. "Jake, we have reports from 37 new communities this month. Water purification systems in Bangladesh, solar installations in Kenya, sustainable housing projects in Guatemala. The technologies are spreading faster than we ever anticipated." The UN designation as International Environmental Heritage had eliminated corporate interference while creating mechanisms for supporting community implementation. Environmental organizations provided funding and technical assistance. Academic institutions contributed research and training. Government agencies offered regulatory support and legal protection. But the most significant development was something no one had anticipated. Communities were improving and adapting the technologies faster than the original research facilities could have managed alone. "The open-source approach is creating innovation acceleration we never imagined," Dr. Santos explained. "When thousands of communities are implementing the same basic technologies, they discover improvements and adaptations that no single research facility could develop." Jake had seen this phenomenon firsthand through the network's communication systems. A water purification adaptation developed in a refugee camp in Jordan had been implemented in rural communities across South America within weeks. Solar collection improvements discovered in an Arctic research station had been adapted for desert communities in Australia and Africa. Godfather Tony was right about sharing technologies, Rosie observed that evening as they reviewed implementation reports from around the world. People make them better when they can work on them together. Jake had come to understand that Tony's greatest innovation wasn't any individual technology. It was the open-source, community-based approach to environmental problem-solving that made rapid global implementation possible. The treehouse's communication systems now connected Jake and Rosie to a global community of environmental innovators that included not just the original research facilities, but thousands of communities. that had become research and development centers in their own right. The network is becoming something beyond what any of us originally envisioned, Dr. Elena Rodriguez told Jake during their weekly coordination call. Instead of 12 facilities developing technologies for global distribution, we have thousands of communities developing technologies for local needs that happen to work globally. Jake looked around the treehouse laboratory, still filled with Tony's original prototypes, but now supplemented with innovations that had been developed by community implementers around the world. The distinction between technology developers and technology users had dissolved, creating exactly the kind of collaborative innovation that Tony had envisioned. As autumn arrived in the forest, Jake received a letter that made him understand how completely their lives had changed. It was from the mayor of Cedar Falls, inviting him to speak at the dedication of the town's new sustainability center, a facility that would implement network technologies to make their community completely self-sufficient within 5 years. The lumber mill closing felt like the end of our town's future, the mayor wrote. But your godfather's innovations have given us a new beginning. We're becoming a model for how communities can thrive while healing the environment that sustains them. Jake thought about the journey from that first eviction notice to this invitation to help his own community implement sustainable technologies. The contrast felt both surreal and inevitable, the natural result of choosing to protect and share innovations rather than sell them for personal profit. Are you going to help our town become sustainable, like the treehouse? Rosie asked when Jake read her the mayor's letter. I think we're going to help lots of towns become sustainable, Jake replied. That's what Godfather Tony wanted. That evening, as father and daughter watched the sunset from the observation deck, Jake reflected on everything that had changed since they first climbed the stairs to Tony's treehouse. They had gained not just financial security, but purpose that connected them to a global community, working to heal the relationship between human civilization and the natural world. The forest around them was quiet, except for the whisper of wind through branches and the distant sound of water flowing through Tony's purification systems. Solar batteries hummed softly, storing energy from the day's sunlight. The integrated systems that Tony had built worked in perfect harmony with the forest environment, proving every day that human technology could enhance rather than degrade the natural world. Dad, Rosie said, as stars became visible through the forest canopy. Do you think Godfather Tony knows what happened? Jake looked at his daughter, silhouetted against the treehouse's gentle lighting, and felt Tony's presence in her thoughtful question and his own certainty about the answer. I think he knows exactly what happened, Jake replied, and I think he's proud of what we've all accomplished together. As they went inside for the evening, Jake noticed new growth around the base of the massive redwood tree, young shoots that were part of the tree's natural regeneration cycle. Tony had explained once that redwood trees could live for thousands of years, creating forests that sustained themselves through cycles of growth, adaptation, and renewal. The metaphor seemed perfect for what they had inherited and were helping to nurture. Tony's innovations weren't just technological solutions to environmental problems. They were the foundation for a new approach to human civilization that could sustain itself through generations of growth, adaptation, and renewal. The eviction. Notice that had once seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something extraordinary. What people had called worthless had proven to hold the deepest value, not just for Jake and Rosie, but for communities around the world that were discovering how to live in harmony with the environments that sustained them. As Jake tucked Rosie into the bed that folded down from the treehouse wall, he realized that Tony's greatest gift hadn't been the technologies themselves, but the understanding that true wealth came from helping others create abundance and resilience for themselves. They had inherited a treehouse worth millions of dollars, but they had chosen to use it to help create a world where clean water, renewable energy, and sustainable housing were worth far more than money. They were the foundation for hope.